I'm a 25-year-old lady named Amber, and I lead a life that seems to be largely in the background. Without a full-time job to guide me, I've been attempting to figure things out for a while. I've been quite private, so it hasn't been an easy path. My education terminated at the middle school level, since I completed high school, but ultimately dropped out. I've been living with my parents ever since, doing part-time jobs and starting internet freelancing projects whenever I can. Brian, my older brother, is 3 years older than me. He is the total antithesis of me. He is gregarious, well-liked, and an excellent athlete. Wherever he goes, he manages to make friends, while I like to be by myself. Brian didn't want anyone to know that I was his sister. He hardly ever brought people home, and he would utterly ignore me if I ran into him at the convenience store. I came to terms with that. It seemed to be his problem, not mine. I stopped caring about it after he moved out and went off to college. But then things started to change. Brian began dating, and soon there was talk of him getting married. He would be turning 28 soon, so it wasn't too surprising when they announced that he would bring his fiancée over to meet our parents. I happened to be home that day and decided to join them. "Dad, Mom, I'm home," I called out as I stepped through the door, just as Brian arrived. When he saw me sitting there with our parents, he looked confused for a moment. It was a brief flicker of surprise before his face returned to its usual calm. "Sorry to intrude," his fiancée said as she entered the house, seeming completely unaware of the awkwardness between us. She looked over at me and said, "Hi," but her eyes were clearly asking Brian, "Who is this?" It was obvious he hadn't mentioned me to her at all. "Thank you for coming all this way. I'm Brian's mother," my mom said, introducing herself, "and this is his father." She didn't mention me at all. The fiancé, whose name I would soon learn was Lauren, seemed satisfied with the introductions, bowing politely, but the confusion didn't leave her face. My father didn't follow up to introduce me either. It felt like I was invisible in that moment. My parents had always been hard on me, especially compared to my accomplished brother. They often used to say things like, "Your brother can do it, why can't you?" It felt like part of our upbringing, but as we grew older, their words turned harsher. Eventually, I became the money-sucking leech in their eyes. I could sense that they were planning to ignore me during this meeting too. "I'll go and get some more drinks," my mother said as she stood up to leave. Before she walked away, she leaned in and whispered, "Why are you here? Go back to your room." I had hoped to show my family that I wanted to be a part of things, to connect in my own way, but it felt like my attempts were falling flat. Still, I couldn't bring myself to leave. I stayed where I was, trying to blend into the background. Lauren introduced herself to my parents with a bright smile, and I couldn't help but feel a pang of jealousy. She was the same age as me, but exuded a beauty and grace that made her seem so much more refined. I felt a bit out of place, like an awkward teenager again. My brother, however, seemed a little annoyed by my presence. He introduced Lauren to Mom and Dad, but completely ignored me. I felt like a ghost, floating in and out of their conversation without being seen. After they talked about the wedding and the upcoming plans, the conversation shifted to casual chatter. Still, Brian acted as if I didn't exist. I felt invisible sitting there while everyone else shared stories and laughter. Then Brian turned to me and asked, "So what do you usually do, Amber?" Before I could respond, he cut me off, saying, "Wait, Lauren, you don't need to talk to her." His words were clear and dismissive. Lauren looked surprised, glancing between the two of us as if trying to gauge what was happening. That's right. Don't worry about it, my mother chimed in, her voice almost cheerful. Yeah, don't worry about it. She's just a stranger with a blood relation. When my father added, a stranger, huh? Something inside me snapped. It hit me hard. A painful realization that reconciliation was impossible. It felt like they had already decided that I was an outsider in my own family. The meeting ended soon after, and it felt as if my presence hadn't mattered at all. I might as well have been invisible, and it left me feeling more isolated than ever. Not long after that awkward evening, Brian and Lauren got married. They started building a house together, creating a life that seemed so vibrant compared to mine. Brian had graduated from college and landed a job at a well-known company. He was still in his 20s, but his income was impressive, making me feel even more inadequate. Lauren decided to quit her job to become a stay-at-home wife, and I watched from a distance as they settled into their new life. Eventually, we received an invitation to their housewarming party. It would be a small gathering with close friends and family, including Lauren's relatives and Brian's bosses. My mother was buzzing with excitement. Oh, it's already finished. Time flies. We need to prepare a housewarming gift. What should we get? My father casually flipped over the invitation and said, We're family, so it doesn't have to be anything fancy. But as he turned it, I noticed that only his name and my mother's name were listed on the invitation. My name was nowhere to be found. It was as if my existence had been erased from the family narrative. My mother seemed to catch on to this oversight and turned to me, asking, Amber, you're coming too, right? Her words confused me. What does she mean? After the way they had introduced me at the previous meeting, I thought it would be fine if I wasn't invited. It's okay. I don't need to go, I replied hesitantly, trying to brush it off, but my mother insisted. No, you're coming. The determination in her voice made it clear that this was non-negotiable. So I found myself caught in the middle of my family's plans, feeling like an unwelcome guest in my own life. I made arrangements and ended up going to the party. On the day of the gathering, the sky darkened, and suddenly it started raining. My parents and I took a taxi to my brother's house. But as we arrived, Brian and Lauren didn't come out to welcome us. They stayed inside, perhaps hoping the rain would keep them hidden. As soon as we pulled up to the house, my mother turned to me and said, You pay for the taxi. Without waiting for my response, she stepped out of the car with my father, both of them hurrying toward the entrance without umbrellas. They seemed eager to escape the rain, and I could see the distance between my brother's house and ours. I thought it was a bit extravagant to take a taxi, but I didn't argue. I was the one stuck with the bill, and after I paid the driver, I scrambled to catch up with my parents. When I got to the entrance, Lauren looked at me and asked, Who are you? I realized that I had only met her once before, and she might have forgotten me. So I introduced myself. I'm Amber, Brian's sister. But her response surprised me. She smiled and said, Ah, the high school dropout. Then, with a casual tone that made my stomach churn, she added, We didn't invite the parasite living off her parents. Her words stung, but it was my brother who walked in just then and echoed Lauren's disdain. Huh, why are you here? He asked, sounding annoyed. Hey, Brian, I told you not to invite her. Why is she here? I felt a wave of embarrassment wash over me. It was clear that Brian didn't want me there, and Lauren's attitude shifted entirely. Now that she knew who I was, she was even worse than my brother and parents when it came to their dismissive treatment of me. Would it have been better if I didn't come? asked my brother cautiously, trying to gauge his reaction. Yeah, you're a stranger, he replied coldly. Your lack of education doesn't even count as an education. Could you please leave the property quickly? Lauren chimed in, her expression calm yet terrifying. It felt like she was siding with him, and I could sense that I was no longer welcome. I turned on my heel and left, feeling humiliated. The taxi had already driven away, and since we weren't on a main street, finding another one seemed nearly impossible. I didn't have an umbrella, and as I trudged through the rain, I could hear Lauren's laughter behind me. After a while, I finally made it home. My parents returned, looking as though they had enjoyed themselves. When they saw my face, they frowned. Why did you leave so suddenly? You couldn't even call a taxi for the way back. You're so useless, my mother complained, her tone as harsh as ever. Sorry, I suddenly had a stomach ache. I lied, trying to cover up the real reason for my departure. My mother's response was typical for such a reason. You left on your own? You're hopeless. Make sure to give the gift later. You're an adult, my father chimed in, his voice a mix of disappointment and exasperation. Speaking of the gift, I had prepared something to bring to the party, but I ended up taking it back home with me. I wanted to send it to them by mail, but I didn't have their address. Asking my parents felt awkward, given the tension that had built up, so I decided to contact my brother directly. You're running a company? My brother said with a smirk, scanning the office with an air of superiority. Well, it's much smaller than where I work. Who are you? I asked, pretending I didn't know them, my heart racing with a mix of dread and disbelief. What's with the attitude? My brother shouted, losing his temper. Before I could respond, my mother intervened. We talked about this before, she said, her tone shifting to a more pleading one. We need your support. You're running a company, so you can help us out, right? I was taken aback by her shamelessness. It felt like she was asking for money, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Yeah, it's an important time for our family. Lauren chimed in, her eyes wide and sincere. I'm about to give birth, and the baby's growth isn't good, so we need to see a good doctor. Please, Amber, my father joined in, making it sound like it was my duty to bail everyone out. As employees occasionally walked by the reception area, I felt a wave of embarrassment wash over me. They were causing a disturbance, and I wanted to get rid of them as quickly as possible. Please leave. You're causing a disturbance, I said, my voice firm but strained. My brother exploded with anger again. What do you mean? A disturbance? We came all the way here, and that's how you talk to your family. He yelled, his voice rising. The employees passing by stopped in their tracks, glancing over with concern. I could feel their eyes on me, and I hated every second of it. Then my brother began to make a scene. Do you all know this girl? She dropped out of middle school. She was a shut-in. No need, he shouted, seemingly intent on humiliating me. But to my surprise, the employees responded with words my brother clearly didn't expect. We know. Everyone knows the president's background. Me too, one of them said, looking defiant. The president hires many people from similar situations. Is there a problem? My brother, who typically surrounded himself with highly educated and high-income people, seemed caught off guard. He stammered, My father wasn't about to let it go either. What a pathetic company, just a gathering of needs, he yelled. Exactly. Companies that do business with a place like this can't be any good either, my brother added, his voice booming in the small space. Just then, the president of the company I was meeting with walked out, clearly having heard the commotion. My brother's face went blank, then turned pale as he recognized the man standing before him. He lowered his gaze, panic washing over him. "What's wrong, Brian?" Lauren asked, looking confused. "Idiot, don't say my name," my brother whispered urgently, but it was too late. "Brian? Oh, it's you," the company president exclaimed, walking straight up to my brother and looking at him with a mixture of surprise and recognition. "You're the guy who always falls short. Mr. Long, the division manager, right? We owe a lot to your company." My brother was sweating profusely, his composure shattering as the realization set in. That's," he stammered, trying to save face. "I guess I'm not memorable, since we're not a decent company." When the president threw my brother's words back at him, it was clear that my brother was completely caught off guard. "Oh," he muttered, freezing up like a deer in headlights. The tension in the room was palpable. My father, mother, and Lauren, the trouble brewing, fell silent. The atmosphere shifted as employees continued to watch, their curiosity piqued. "Do you really think you can just come in here and demand money?" I finally said, feeling a mix of anger and vindication. "You've treated me like I didn't matter. You can't just expect me to step in and save the day because you messed up." My brother opened his mouth to argue, but the president of the company cut him off. "If you're in trouble, you need to take responsibility for your actions, Brian. It's not Amber's job to bail you out, especially when you've treated her this way." My brother's face turned red with embarrassment. He glanced at Lauren, who seemed caught between supporting her husband and recognizing the gravity of the situation. "Let's go," I said, feeling a sense of empowerment I hadn't felt in years. I was done with being their punching bag. "You need to figure this out on your own." As I turned to walk back into my office, I heard the president call after me, "Amber, don't let them drag you down. You've built something here, and you deserve respect for it." His words felt like a lifeline. I knew I had made the right choice to cut ties with my family. They were toxic, and I didn't need their negativity in my life anymore. After I closed my office door, I took a deep breath, letting the stress of the situation wash away. I had worked hard to create my own path, and I wasn't going to let my brother's mistakes derail my success. As the day wore on, I reflected on how far I had come. I had transitioned from feeling like an outcast in my own family to running my own business and making a name for myself. I was finally in control of my life, and no one could take that away from me. In the days that followed, I kept my distance from my family. I focused on my business, working harder than ever to ensure its success. It felt good to be busy, to have purpose, and to know that I was no longer defined by my past or my family's expectations. I knew that my brother's situation wouldn't be the last I heard from them. But for now, I was content to build my life on my own terms. I turned to the president, still feeling the weight of the moment. "I'm sorry for taking up your valuable time," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos outside my office. "I'll ask them to leave." "Oh, are you sure?" he replied, a kind smile on his face. "I have time today, so I don't mind waiting. You can prioritize talking with your family." I shook my head. "No, they're not my family." I glanced back at my parents' and brother's family, their expressions a mix of shock and indignation. They're complete strangers. With that, my parents' and brother's family were ushered out of the building. Maybe they were stunned by the confrontation with the company president, but they left quietly, the air thick with tension as the door closed behind them. I felt a rush of relief mixed with lingering curiosity. I had always known my family's dynamic was complicated, but this was a whole new level of estrangement. Once the commotion settled, I felt compelled to look into how my family had discovered where I worked. It didn't take long to uncover the truth. Lauren was the source. She had a friend who was well connected and always tuned in to investment-related news. This young woman was making waves in her 20s. As a talented trader and company owner, it turned out that Lauren's former boyfriend had been involved. Lauren had been shocked to see a photo of this woman in the media. Realizing that she was my brother's sister, the middle school dropout she had once dismissed, it dawned on me that Lauren had probably told my brother and parents about me, suggesting they ask me for money. Since I was busy and hadn't answered their calls, when they didn't hear back from me, they decided to show up at my company unannounced. As I pieced everything together, it became clear that Lauren had manipulated the situation to her advantage. Her friend, still in touch with Lauren, had been involved in my parents' and brother's financial losses. I couldn't help but dig deeper into Lauren's life, driven by a mix of curiosity and anger. What I discovered shocked me. The child Lauren was carrying was my brother's, but it belonged to her ex-boyfriend, the investor who had led my brother down this disastrous path. No way. My brother must have been devastated to learn that everything had been a lie. In the wake of the truth coming to light, my brother and Lauren ended up getting a divorce. Lauren, along with her ex-boyfriend, was placed under police custody. Yet, the money they had lost wasn't going to be returned anytime soon. The fallout from this incident rippled through both their lives and my brother's career. Once a rising star in his 20s, he found himself relegated to a window-side department, a term used to describe the less desirable positions in a company. Eventually, he resigned, unable to handle the pressure and humiliation of his financial failures and the chaos surrounding him. Things didn't improve for my father either. He got into trouble when the president witnessed him losing his temper with a subcontractor. After an investigation into his work attitude, he was fired. I could only imagine the irony. He had spent years belittling others for not having a prestigious education, spouting phrases like, "Junior high or high school graduates are worthless." Now, he was on the other side of that equation. The words he used to shame me came back to haunt him. Both my brother and father found themselves unemployed in the aftermath. My former family, now reduced to an unemployed trio, began to reach out to me. They would call, text, or even send letters asking to reunite and live together. Despite everything that had transpired, they still clung to the notion of family. They didn't understand the extent of the rift that had formed between us. To ensure they couldn't show up unannounced, I had them banned from entering my company's building. It felt like a necessary step to protect myself from their attempts to force their way back into my life. I had built something from the ground up, and I wasn't about to let them disrupt my hard-earned peace. "Hey, we're still family, right?" they would say, trying to leverage our past connections to gain access to my life again. But I had a different view. "I don't know you. You're complete strangers to me," I responded every time. I have no intention of giving any other response in the future. With each exchange, I felt a sense of empowerment. I had worked hard to forge my own path and create a life that was meaningful to me. The pain of my family's rejection had taught me valuable lessons about self-worth and boundaries. I no longer felt obligated to accommodate their needs, especially when their past behavior had been so toxic. I learned to appreciate the pleasures of independence in my newfound seclusion. I concentrated on my business, networking with other people and looking for fresh prospects. I threw myself into my work, thankful that I could define who I was without having to worry about what my family thought of me. In retrospect, I see that cutting off contact with my family was among the wisest moves I could have made. Those who had previously attempted to minimize me were now the ones requesting assistance. Even though I could relate to their difficulties, I realized that I had to put my own health first. My life was now determined by the decisions I made every day, rather than by my past. I felt more resilient than ever as I developed new connections and kept growing my business. The future held promise, and I was resolved to seize any chance that presented itself.